Hi everyone, it is week two of our SSE 248 course. What we're going to be dealing with in this week is we're very specifically going to be looking at the role of slavery in the United States history in general, but also very specifically in the next lecture of how slavery was the cause of the coming of the war. So. The one thing that I really want to start off with looking at is the idea and the centrality that slavery played in American history before even the formation of America. With the quote unquote discovery of the New World, slavery was always a part of the European experience there. Slavery, for the most part, did not exist in much of Western and Northern and Central Europe by the 16th century. But as Europeans started to expand out into new regions, one of the things, of course, that became very obvious was in terms of this new world, taking advantage of all of the natural resources and possible riches that were there, labor forces were necessary. And it was very quickly noticeable that there was a huge population of people already here in the United States and in the New World already existent here, and that only certain numbers of Europeans were very much interested in coming over. And so in order to work and build wealth in terms of mining, in terms of farming, in terms of the growing of cash crops, it became very quickly noticeable that the population who already existed here, i.e. the Native Americans, were going to be the ones who were going to be the muscle power to produce the wealth of the New World for the European states. This quickly became something that was not going to work, though, because of a couple of reasons. One, because to enslave Native Americans, as was often done at this point, it was very difficult to keep Native Americans in enslavement because this was their land and it was very easy for Native Americans to escape slavery. So that was one of the main things. But the other main thing, and probably the biggest reason that slavery of Native Americans was never took off to the extent of what we'll see with African slavery in the New World, is because of the diseases that Europeans brought with them that wiped out huge numbers of Native Americans from the first contact in the 16th century all the way into the 19th century. So the estimates are sometimes put that 90% of all Native Americans within 100 years of European contact were wiped out because of different diseases and plagues that spread from that contact. And so a labor force was necessary, and eventually Europeans started to discover the possibility of getting cheap labor from Africa. The African slave trade, of course, the slave trade within Africa had a long history as slavery was an ancient institution. It was a part of almost every society from the beginnings of civilization, and Africa was no different. The difference was that when Europeans come to start to practice the slave trade, it becomes much bigger than it ever was before, and also, which we won't have that much time to deal with in this class, you start to see the beginning ideas of what becomes, in our minds, what we recognize as race. For Africans, of course, language differences, cultural differences, tribal differences were often central, and slavery would be based upon those differences. As Europeans started to expand into the slave trade and really make it much larger and make it international between Europe, Africa, and the New World, race and the new ideas of race started to play a much larger role. In other words, skin color, of course, most specifically, but notions that came out of that dealing with all sorts of different beliefs in regards to what that meant towards categorizations of different people. So what is really the thing that starts to kick off African slavery is the beginning growth of cash crops in the New World. And one of the first and most important is sugar, which was being grown in North Africa and the islands off of North Africa and in the Middle East in some places before the discovery of the New World. But with the discovery of the New World, sugar was seen as growing very well in the tropical climates of the Caribbean specifically. And so sugar plantations started to grow on these islands. And the sugar plantations, it was hard, difficult, horrific, deadly work oftentimes. And these plantations, of course, would be run by a very small number of Europeans and would be worked upon by enslaved Africans and Native Americans specifically. And this really kicked off this enormous globalization of trade and huge economic boom in Europe. Europeans loved sugar. They wanted sugar. They, of course, were obsessed with sugar. It started to become central to so many different aspects of diet, from, of course, the ability to cook more desserts to being utilized in tea and coffee. And this plantation system was a system of wealth for all of the European nations who were involved in this. And England was kind of a late comer in all of this. In fact, England in the 16th century, late 16th century, was often pirating Spanish ships for gold and other wealth coming from the New World. And so what England started to do, of course, was to settle upon the eastern United States with what become known, of course, by Americans as the 13 colonies being formed in the early 17th century. The most famous, of course, of those two colonies was Virginia, where the first permanent settlement at Jamestown was, and also Massachusetts in the north with our ideas of the Pilgrims and, of course, Thanksgiving and all the things go with this. The thing, of course, is that the British did find people here. Oftentimes, the land was very accessible, however, because many Native Americans had been wiped out by diseases that had come in the 20 years or so from traders before this. But there was the precariousness of these early days of colonial America. It was a very tough, hard world in which a lot of times, in Virginia specifically, people were often looking for new starts and wealth and were only interested in that for the most part. Massachusetts, of course, was a little different, but one of the things that we can see is from this earliest days, these 13 colonies were extremely diverse in terms of in terms of what we call ethnicity. Today, you had Brits, you had Scots, Irish, Dutch, you had Germans, you had French, of course, Spanish were there, you have Native Americans, and then you, of course, have Africans as well, who have been coming since 1619 with the first slave ship to America being brought into Jamestown. Slavery took a while to really take off in the United States, but when it did, it had to do with the growth of these cash crops like sugar. Now, sugar couldn't grow in these kind of climates, but in South Carolina, you had things like rice. In North Carolina and Virginia, in Maryland, you had tobacco. In the North, you didn't have so many cash crops. The farms were often smaller, and so slavery never took off quite to the extent of what it did in the South with the growth of these cash crops. You had smaller farmers, landholders, things of that sort. So you have now the situation where the North doesn't have as much slavery. There is a good amount of slavery, but they don't have as much as you have in the South. And you start to see a change occur that historians start to identify as the difference between societies with slaves versus slave societies. And the simplest way to put this is that in the North you had a society that had slaves. Slaves were a part of the society. They'd be within homes. They'd help people in terms of jobs and working. But the slavery was nowhere near, oftentimes, as central to the everyday aspect of social order, laws, and larger culture. In the South, you had the slave societies you started to see grow up, in which slavery became central to law codes. It became central to how the people of the South started to identify their culture and their identity. It became their procedure of life. And so it became extremely important in terms of every aspect of the society in the South as the 18th and into the 19th century started to go on. Of course, the most important moment in colonial history is the break that you have of the 13 colonies with Great Britain. But here we see a central aspect of American history that has been a problem that we've been dealing with from the earliest days, and that is the paradox that exists between the notions of things like the Declaration of Independence that call for all men being equal, all men being created equal, and life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness being written and created by people like Thomas Jefferson, people like James Madison in terms of the Constitution, George Washington, these founders who were, of course, writing these types of language, calling themselves, saying that they were themselves in possibly becoming enslaved to the British, who were trying to, of course, take away what they saw as their rights. At the same time, of course, that these people were oftentimes slaveholders themselves. Most of the founders were slaveholders, some much bigger than others. Jefferson had hundreds of slaves, so did Washington. And so you have this paradox that is central to the earliest days of the United States. And this paradox is something that is going to become a rift that will grow bigger and bigger throughout the first decades of the 19th century. And partly this has to do with the way that the Constitution is set up. One of the biggest questions in regards to the Constitution is, in its earliest format, is it there helping slave owners become more powerful, or is it there and making slave owners actually making it so that slavery will slowly die out? Different scholars view this differently. Different people during the time period viewed it differently. But there's no question that in the Constitution, though slavery is never mentioned specifically, it is a part of the Constitution, a very important part. Most notoriously, you have the Three-Fifths Compromise, which of course does not actually say that slaves are 3/5 of a person. What it says is that in counting for representation, for congressional representation, and for the Electoral College, the South will be the southern, or the slaves of the southern states specifically, will be counted as 3/5 of a person, going towards and increasing then the population of southern states and then slaveholders as well, so that it looks to be that they will have more power. And most definitely you had this situation in which the early presidents up until Lincoln, the vast majority were slaveholders, or they were from the South, or they were happy to work with slaveholders if they were from the North. Obviously, we know this because of how much power a president can have, even in these early days of the Republic, because the president then could name Supreme Court justices. And so the Supreme Court is then filled with slaveholders as well. This is this issue that is at the heart of the founding of the United States. And at the beginnings of the United States in 1780s and 90s, the notion was, for many, was that slavery was inevitably going to die out. You did see a wave of people during the Revolutionary era manumitting their slaves, letting people go free. You had larger numbers of free African Americans living within different areas of the North and the South. But the big change that occurs is the growth of the cotton industry. Once cotton becomes a cash crop that is viable, and with the cotton gin, cotton can be produced at a much larger number, you start to see the movement further and further into the West in order to find new lands for cotton specifically. With this, you then start to also see Indian removal, pushing native tribes who had been living, of course, on lands of Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama further and further to the west. This is the infamous Trail of Tears in the 1830s. This was opening up land for the cultivation of cotton. Cotton becomes absolutely, by the 1840s and 50s, the moneymaker for not just the United States, but much of the Western world in general, because cotton is central to the Industrial Revolution, the growth of factories to make clothing, to make goods. Cotton is the fuel that runs those places, that keeps those products being produced. And so the South is the richest part of the United States, and the labor who works to create that cotton, of course, are slaves themselves. Even though slaves are a minority in the South in terms of population, even though a very small minority actually owns slaves within the South, nonetheless, the huge plantations that have hundreds and hundreds of people enslaved upon them are producing most of the cotton for the Industrial Revolution's mills and bankers and all of the things that go with that in the mid 19th century. And so cotton is, as one Southern politician says before the Civil War, king. And it is basically whatever happens with cotton is what's going to happen, it seems, with the world economy. And so the South is incredibly powerful. It's holding huge amounts of governmental, political power, but also economic power as the 19th century goes on. And this has much to do with the formation of the Civil War, as we will see.